Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Catherine Travoyant from the Department of Political and Social Change. And I would like to thank you all for joining us for today's seminar series again. Before I will introduce our speaker today, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians from whose traditional lands I speak and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. So as I already noticed in our discussions before, I'm really pleased to introduce Timothy Williams to you. Tim is a junior professor at the Bundeswehr-Universität München in Germany. So Munich, for those of you who are not familiar with the proper pronunciation of München. And today, Tim has joined us to share some of the research that went into his recently published book, The Complexity of Evil, Perpetration, and Genocide. So the book is out now with Rutgers University Press, and I highly recommend reading it, of course. So as always for our seminar series, we will have 40 minutes that will be dedicated to Tim's presentation and then a 40-minute Q&A. So Tim, again, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to give the presentation at such an early hour for you. And I'm looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to, I'm just trying to share my screen, to present here. I was so thrilled when Catherine asked me to present. I've never given a presentation quite this early in the day, 4:30 a.m. I'm a little bit caffeinated, so I hope I do a good job. Yeah, it's a real thrill to be here and to be able to present the research which has gone into my book and a little bit of what I've been looking at since to you today. I chose the title of "When I Entered the Tiger Zone" as a first quote, as this is one of the most striking quotes that I got from interviews that I conducted with former Khmer Rouge back in 2014, when talking to people about how they came to join the Khmer Rouge, how they came to participate in the violence of the regime in Cambodia back in the 1970s. A couple of years ago, I curated an exhibition, and I was, and this was one of the pictures that the photographer Daniel Welschenbach, who I was working with, had taken. And we were opening an exhibition, I think it was in Frankfurt, here in Germany. And before I gave sort of the opening remarks to this opening, I was milling around listening to what people were saying. And I heard a woman speaking to the man she was there with, say that she could see the evil in the eyes of this man. And I looked back at the photo and I thought, I see absolutely no evil in those eyes. And I just see an ordinary farmer from Cambodia, an ordinary man who, if you know his story, you know he's engaged in extraordinary acts of violence, which these acts you could certainly class as evil, killing people and leading hundreds of others to their death. But I was very struck with the sort of the setting that we were in. It was an exhibition on former Khmer Rouge, but the automatic assumption was that this man must be evil. And so in the course of this presentation, I not only want to argue that he's not an evil monster, but that he's a relatively ordinary man. And even within the societal context of Cambodia, some would even be able to class him as a victim. So the fundamental question of the book, The Complexity of Evil, is why people participate in genocide. And I don't only look at Cambodia in the book, but try and make a more general argument. I'd like to start my presentation with a quote by Heinrich Popitz, because I think that it wonderfully shows how complex this topic is. Popitz says, "A human never has to, but can always violently. He acts violently. He never has to, but can always kill, individually or collectively, together or with a division of labor, in all situations, in different moods, for all imaginable ends, anyone." And I think that this quote really sort of highlights how diverse motivations can be, how diverse perpetrators are, and underlines why I think it's important to try and think about this topic and try and bring a little bit of order into this complexity. I think that research on perpetrators is really important. Now, most research sort of focuses much more strongly on victims or on larger dynamics at the macro level, political and social dynamics. But I think that it's really important to look at perpetrators so that we can understand the actual violence dynamics of how it's implemented. If we ignore perpetrator research, then basically their acts are just exogenous shocks on the system. Of course, I think it's important to emphasize, and I'm sure no one would dare to assume that I'm trying to excuse perpetrators by explaining their behavior. But of course, it's really important to emphasize that just because we understand why someone participates, this doesn't in any way legitimize it. And I think besides the fact that if we only take victims' perspectives, we're obviously going to get a skewed perception of why people are participating, because being victimized by crimes gives one a different perspective on them. But it also now enables us to avoid collectivizing guilt. By understanding who participated in what ways and why, we can pin responsibility much more accurately. There are a couple of sort of stages that perpetrator research has gone through in the social sciences. And it started soon after the Holocaust, looking at Nazi perpetrators, when dispositional explanations were key, where individual personality traits were seen as the key way to understand why people participated. Here, Theodor Adorno was quite prominent with his idea of an authoritarian personality. But also, if we look at the Nuremberg Tribunal, where, for instance, psychological Rorschach tests were done. But in fact, these Rorschach tests were never published at the time because they showed that the idea of a Rorschach test is maybe no longer sort of the state of the art of psychological research, but at the time they were, but they weren't published because they showed that actually almost none of the defendants had any psychological abnormalities. And this went very strongly against the reigning assumptions of the time. And then bit by bit, particularly through social psychological research, situational explanations gained traction. Here, many of you will know Milgram's authority experiments at Yale, or Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. And here, a lot of the social psychological explanations pushed strongly that it's the situations that people are in that mean that they participate. Today, we've diverged back again a little bit to say that it's more the interaction between the situation and how different individuals react to this. I'd like to, before I sort of get into the meat of what I want to present, very briefly talk about the idea of ideology and ethnicity. Because this is one of the most commonly held preconceptions, particularly in Holocaust research, but generally looking at other cases as well. That the way ideology works is not in the way that many of you will remember the Goldhagen debate in the 1990s, where the idea that anti-Semitism had to be eliminationist, where the reason innately that Germans were participating were because of an inborn anti-Semitism. And this was very strongly contrasted by Christopher Browning, who talked about ordinary men. And today, people like Jonathan Leader-Maynard advocate approaches which Jonathan calls it a neo-ideological approach, which looks in a much more stronger degree of how ideology actually impacts perpetrators. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that later. That the more nuanced we look at perpetration in genocide, the more we can understand that ideology is indeed very important. It's not unimportant, as Browning, to a certain degree, tries to argue, but but it has very specific types of influence. Okay, so the book here tries to causally sort different factors, tries to take the wealth of factors that the literature discusses and think about what kind of impact they really have. And to do this, I argue that we can't look at individual perpetrators, but that it's more helpful to look at their individual acts of perpetration. Because by doing this, we look at a specific moment in time, what is motivating them to do that. And this allows us also to think of motivations as dynamic, as ever-changing. And that the reason why I do something now as a perpetrator is different to why I might be doing it tomorrow or the day after. And so by looking at actions, we can understand specific motivations and also how changing situations leads to motivational change. For this, obviously, we need to develop a certain subjective understanding of the situation that the perpetrators are in, which ethically is a challenging endeavor, possibly, but one that I think is important to do nonetheless. The research that I'm going to be presenting now is based on 6 months of field work, which I conducted in Cambodia in 2014. Where I spent time in multiple sites in 10 different provinces. I spent time with 58 former Khmer Rouge conducting in-depth interviews, often multiple times. And in these interviews, they were semi-structured interviews, which started with a very strong narrative component in which I basically asked them to give me their life histories, and then engaged more strongly in thematic interview on some of the topics that I was most interested in, namely their everyday life under the Khmer Rouge and how they came to participate in violence. Now, the model that I've created to explain why people participate in genocide starts off with motivations. Motivations are the impetus for someone to participate in violence. They're the actual reason someone does it. And without a motivation, no one will participate. For anyone interested in methods, this would be what we call an heinous condition. And here I differentiate between 3 types of motivations. And they're all present for some perpetrators and in some cases are more prevalent than others. But I would say that one of the most important groups is in-group motivations. So these are the factors within the perpetrator group that lead someone to participate. So here we have hierarchical motivations of obedience to authority, horizontal pressures, in the form of people wanting to be conform with their group or peer pressure being actively exerted on them. Both horizontal and vertical pressures can be laced with coercion, underlining the threat or actual implementation of violence to these other pressures. People can take on roles or, and in the case of Cambodia, not unimportantly, hope for status within the group. Outgroup motivations are what we much more typically think of when we think of perpetrator motivations, namely ideologies towards the outgroup, towards the victim group, emotional responses of fear or disgust or hatred of the victim group. And these do exist for some perpetrators, but I argue that they're not very prevalent across the board. And then we have opportunistic motivations. So a whole bundle of motivations of why people participate in order to somehow forward their own private interests. And this can be anything from economic interests through looting, their own career, personal conflicts, all the way through to sadistic motivations, which I would also class as an opportunistic motivation. And here there are lots and lots of different factors which can go under this. Now, if we go to Cambodia, I would argue that and this is the most, this is the first motivation that anyone mentions within an interview context, is that they were acting within a totalitarian environment under the control of Oncar. Now, Oncar is a concept known to anyone in Cambodia and remains synonymous with absolute authority and the necessity of unwavering obedience. Literally, Oncar means the organization, but in interviews was also used interchangeably with the higher, with higher leaders, with the party, and here, or even synonymously with the revolution itself. People spoke of Oncar as having pineapple eyes. So basically what this means is that there was this idea that Oncar had so many eyes that it could see anything, something akin to Foucault's idea of a panopticon. And thus any mistake that someone would make, any action which could be deemed anti-revolutionary, would be seen by Oncar, thus making any order given extremely strong, because this authority took, I mean, the authority was so strong because it was then laced with coercion. A quote from a female former Khmer Rouge from Battambang province was, they were ordered to kill that person if they didn't kill themselves. So for their safety, they had to kill. So there's this idea, because Oncar sees everything, that perpetration has to happen. Now, this is obviously quite self-excusing. If people aren't able to refuse and have to participate at pain of their life, then it's a relatively simple story. And when you, this is, like I said, the first thing that everyone says. It's also very credible. The rate of death among Khmer Rouge participants was higher than among the ethnic majority Khmer population, because there was a lot of killing within the Khmer Rouge in the context of purges. But when you talk to people for longer periods of time and go back again and again, they will start to tell you about other forms of motivations, other reasons that they and other people participated. And here, for instance, taking on a role within the Khmer Rouge was an idea. And this is where the quote came from that I mentioned right at the beginning. Here, a former militiaman from Battambang province again said, "When we joined, it was like we were entering into a tiger zone. We had to be a tiger like them. So we needed to be a tiger like them, to be cruel like them, no morality like them." So here, this person is giving a very vivid metaphor of entering a tiger zone. And it's a striking description of the feelings of a young man who had joined the Khmer Rouge and learned what was expected of him as this new member of a militia. It touches not only on how he felt about his surroundings and the new context he was entering, but also what it meant for him and his own identity. He believed that it meant that he had to become a tiger and take on this new identity, which was associated with specific values of being cruel and particular behavioral assumptions of how he should be acting. Within the Cambodian context, status also plays an important role. Anyone who works on Cambodia will know that the way society is structured is along very nuanced hierarchical assumptions of status. Now, while the Khmer Rouge, as part of its radical communist Maoist doctrine, attempted to eradicate all forms of status hierarchy, it actually basically just replaced the old system with a new form of hierarchy in which the Khmer Rouge was on top, followed by so-called base people, people who had been living on the land as peasants, as farmers, when the Khmer Rouge took power. And then at the bottom, new people, those who'd been expelled from the city when the Khmer Rouge took power. And so this concept of status and hierarchy is then also reinforced by concepts of losing face that are very strongly culturally anchored. And so people don't want to lose honor within their new position within a hierarchical relationship. And so this also gives ideas of obedience a stronger emphasis possibly than in other contexts. Now, looking at perpetrators in Cambodia, one of the primary works before my book was by Alexander Hinton, and he emphasizes a lot of these really cultural specificities. And my book could be seen as an argument against a lot of what he's saying, but I wouldn't say that. I would say that a lot of the work that Alex Hinton has done is useful and valid, but it's how it fits into these other slightly more mundane motivations and renders them important. Now, lastly, in Cambodia, in terms of motivations, we see opportunism as key as well. However, it's not like in other cases where people are trying to get rich, where people are hoping for benefits above and beyond what they possibly imagined when they joined the groups. But instead, it's much more about survival. When we think of Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, there's mass starvation, there's hundreds of thousands of people dying of disease, of overwork. And so within this context, people believed that if they participated in the Khmer Rouge and were able to keep their positions, they would be able to have a slightly more comfortable living. They'd have easier, readier access to food. They'd have less work to do, particularly people within the killing groups were expected to do, and I say this in inverted commas, nothing but kill. And so in this context where people were being overworked, just having to kill meant that you were also able to rest quite a lot, and was seen as important. There are also stories of people being able to eat the livers of the people that they'd killed. Not many people speak about this, but this was told to me by two people in interviews as well. And in a source of extreme malnourishment, this act of cannibalism can also be seen as a survival opportunistic motivation. But it goes beyond this as well. People also talked about how killing also made it easier to be promoted. People also talked about how personal conflicts that predated the genocide and even predated the Civil War were key to who would then be identified as an enemy, and that these prior conflicts had nothing to do with the system of the Khmer Rouge, but the accusations were then faked in order to enact personal or political revenge. Now, I argue in the book that it goes beyond just motivations. And that a lot of the factors that are spoken about in the perpetrator literature are actually not the key impetus why someone participates, but instead what I call facilitative factors. That means that they make participation easier when they're present, but they only work when someone is already motivated by something else. So here, this is where a lot of ideologies work, justifying and legitimizing the violence, but not the actual reason people participate. Moral disengagement sees people dehumanizing the victims or trying to disaggregate the responsibility and their role within it. Group dynamics here, taking on an anonymous role, for instance. Lots of these kinds of factors play into this. In Cambodia, interestingly, whereas in other cases, social dynamics within the perpetrator group, in terms of peer dynamics, not just obedience to authority, were absolutely key to understanding why people participate. This is less so in the Khmer Rouge. And this was one of the sort of things which surprised me most when I was doing the research. But then this is not surprising in a context in which people were often assigned to other units in a different part of the country very quickly after they were recruited, and often split up immediately before or after their initial training. And through regular reassignments within the Khmer Rouge, which happened a lot, people were very often, again and again, thrown into new social situations. And so in this context, and a context of increasing paranoia of the regime and increasing purges, there was strong fear of denunciations, which led actually, rather than peer pressure within friendship groups and groups of comrades, which we see in other cases, we actually see a strong degree of social isolation. But this is also important for understanding subjectively why people participate. This constant mistrust and fearing of comrades actually places even more emphasis on understanding the situation through the orders that were given by one's superordinates. And it also allows people to displace responsibility. People remained pretty much anonymous within their groups. They neither knew the people they were victimizing nor the people they were victimizing with to any strong degree. And so somehow through this anonymity, people were able to act in ways that social psychologists sort of speak of anonymity as facilitative because it takes away a lot of the inhibitions. At the same time, responsibility was relatively easily displaced to Oncar, with the sort of a quote that came up again and again in interviews was that it was the law, the orders that were being given to them. Also, the quote that there was no law. And it's precisely this discontinuity between the two, this arbitrariness, that makes Oncar even stronger, because people are more dependent on the orders given by specific individuals who are superior to them. And this facilitates the direct attribution of responsibility to the system of Oncar, and thus makes it psychologically easier for people to participate. And secondly, it removes an alternative system of morality to which to apply, because beyond those concrete orders that were received. And lastly, social distance to victims was easily maximized within this social isolation system. Next, it's important to think about how, in terms of facilitative factors, how ideology worked within the Khmer Rouge. The system was self-perpetuating, and it reinforced perceptions of threatening individuals. Anyone who was arrested as an enemy because they were suspected to have committed mistakes and were accused of being guilty of this was guilty, because Oncar was never wrong, because Oncar saw everything. And this meant also that ascriptions of who an enemy was and were highly believed within the Khmer Rouge groups. And I was surprised to find that while many of my interviewees said, surely not everyone we killed was actually an internal enemy, Oncar maybe wasn't right always, possibly only half were CIA or KGB and seen as these external agents and internal enemies. And so even this idea that so many still actually were legitimately killed shows how strongly this ideology resonated. And the anti-Vietnamese nationalism, which was prevalent later during the regime, was absolutely key, and it was already fomented during during, or continue to be fomented during the Civil War, which succeeded the Khmer Rouge regime, and it made it quite easy to sort of buy into this idea that there were internal enemies. Now, lastly, the last element of my model is contextual conditions. Now, these are, here we sort of diverge from the micro and meso level of individuals and groups that I've been at so far, to look at the macro level context in which this is occurring. And this is what a lot of the political science work has been on in the past, looking at dynamics which lead to genocide. And I don't want to talk about this a lot. And also in the book, this is, I talk a little bit about the contextual conditions and what they mean for individual perpetrators. But I think they are important because this is the structure which creates a framework within which everything is understood. So factors of the state and how obedience or how authority structures are create an environment which is facilitative or not so facilitative of obedience. Specific cultural ideas are located here. A lot of Alex Hinton's work is here and structures the way that people perceive the world. Ideas of uncertainty and insecurity are really key to this, and shape how the enemy is then presented as threatening, how ideologies can resonate. And so I think that these contextual conditions are really important, but they don't help us differentiate between those who do participate and those who don't, because everyone is acting within the same context here. Now, to summarize this part, in general, I think that it's important that we differentiate causally between these motivations, facilitative factors, and contextual conditions. And this, for instance, helps us think of ideology in a different way to just the simple people killed because they're ideologues, because they're fanatics. Sorry. I think I'd like to emphasize the key role of group dynamics within the perpetrator group and opportunistic factors, but also how facilitative factors are important for understanding why people participate through psychological mechanisms, through group dynamics, and here ideology, but that they take on a different causal role to how they're often argued in the literature. And then lastly, I think that this helps us understand how people participate for different reasons at different times. In Cambodia, perpetration is different to other cases in terms of the social dynamics and peer group dynamics and the role of social isolation. But there are a lot of similarities to other cases in the forms of how authority works, how people talk about coercion. It may be a different form of opportunism, but these opportunistic factors are structured in similar ways. Beyond survival opportunism, we see career, personal and political revenge, and so on. And again, the role of ideology in constructing a threatening enemy and in legitimizing the violence, but not being the actual key motivator, is again similar to other cases. And interestingly, you see absolutely no ideological adherence to Maoism, and actually very little knowledge of the ideological precepts of the Khmer Rouge within the interviews that I was conducting. And now I have about 5-6 minutes left. I'd like to talk a little bit now about how former Khmer Rouge talk about themselves today. Because obviously within the interview settings, most people were not talking about themselves as perpetrators. This idea of, I mean, I never used the label of perpetrator within my interviews, but people talk about themselves in ways that construct themselves actively not as perpetrators. And they do this by discussing violence in a very narrow way. People locate responsibility for the killing either with Oncar, displacing their agency and any idea of responsibility up the chain of command. And interestingly, if pressed, people who had people working for them would refer to Oncar. And if you said, well, how do your subordinates see you? They would say, they see me as the higher, as Oncar as well, but I in turn am only sort of the vessel of the orders from above. So thus locating responsibility really only with the very highest leaders. And at the same time, the violence is restricted to only those who kill. People who arrest, who guard, who interrogate, who torture, who transport victims, who create lists, who decide who's going to be killed and who's not going to be killed. These people don't see themselves as part of the killing process. It's very strongly isolated to the actual act of killing itself, rendering everyone else in their perceptions as non-perpetrators. Also, interestingly, several people in interviews emphasized the acts of resistance that they engaged in, and thus I would argue actually showing that there was the capacity to take agency. There was this, there were situations where people could take their fate into their own hands, and the acts of resistance were often very spontaneous. They were very low key. It was the act of crossing someone off a list, of warning someone that they were going to be arrested, of underwriting someone who was one's subordinate, that they were not an enemy of the state. In fact, they were sick. They weren't just pretending, which was, for instance, one of the reasons why people were sometimes killed when they were too exhausted to work. It was seen as rebellion. So there were all these kinds of acts of resistance which people unsurprisingly highlighted to me, but which I thought was interesting in what it meant for their agency. But much more prominent is claims among almost everyone I spoke to of victimhood. And here, the categories that people referred to were the same as the categories which, in later research that I conducted, that also many of the more clear-cut victims of the Khmer Rouge adhered to. So most frequently, people refer to the fact that they lost family members. Every single person I spoke to as a former Khmer Rouge lost family members. At the same time, they were also, they feared for their lives. They perceived the threats to their security very strongly. And indeed, there were higher security threats to former Khmer Rouge than were to ethnic majority population. Of course, ethnic minorities were even more strongly targeted. They also say they were hungry and overworked. So they fit into a lot of the same categories that other victims adhered to. Interestingly, no one in any of the interviews refers to child soldiering as a category. Many of the people I spoke to were still children when they were recruited. But this is neither in interviews nor in the general discourse on Cambodia a category adhered to, which we do find in other cases much more strongly. And so here, I would say that these ideas of people being complex political actors, they're perpetrators, but they also, at other points in time, can be bystanders, that they also refer to themselves as rescuers and victims. This is a useful way of thinking about former Khmer Rouge, particularly when we think over time and differentiating different actions at different points in time. And this is also fed into quite strongly by the post-violence politics of memory, which Hun Sen, Prime Minister Hun Sen's government has adhered to, reinforcing the idea that former Khmer Rouge can appeal to victimhood, which is quite useful. And I'm going to end here with this picture from Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, in which we have a memorial the only one in Cambodia in which the names of the victims of the space are listed. And because Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum is located in the space which was the former security center S21, which was the highest security center and dealt with the highest threats, which were most often internal threats, people who'd been purged within the party. Actually, the majority of people who were processed in this space, tortured in this space, and then killed were former Khmer Rouge. So interestingly, here we have former Khmer Rouge as even listed down with their names as former Khmer Rouge. And this plays into the, like I said, into the politics of memory within Cambodia quite strongly. And there's a longer history and story behind the monument and how it was constructed. But I hope that what I've been able to present today from my book and from my other research is that this differentiation between perpetration and perpetrators is useful, that by causally differentiating various different factors that I do in the complexity of evil model, we can see that many of the motivations that people have are actually very everyday mundane motivations, but they're also very differentiated and nuanced and complex. And it's how they figure within this broader context which renders them meaningful. And the perpetration is quite different to other cases in some ways regarding group dynamics, but also has a lot of similarities.